You're only going to find out what people need or what makes them feel the most comfortable if you've built the relationship first, and you're not going to build that relationship with a didactic hierarchy.
Hello, and welcome to No Running in the Corridors, the rebel podcast that aims to rewrite the school rulebook, one regulation at a time. My name is Helen Mulley, and joining me in the soundproofed secret meeting room this week, ready to rearrange the furniture and overturn an assumption or two along the way, and yes, that is a clue to this episode's topic, I am thrilled to be able to introduce two thoroughly excellent guests. Lewis Ames is founder of the Children of the Forest education organisation and podcast, about which we will definitely learn more later. And he's a passionate advocate for child-centred and outdoor learning. Hello, Lewis.
Hiya, how you doing?
Very well, thank you. And Leslie Patterson is a former teacher, now an author and education consultant with extensive experience across nursery, infant and primary education, particularly in the early years. Hello, Leslie.
Hello, thank you for having me.
I'm very glad to have both of you. Now, given your respective areas of expertise, I am very excited about revealing the rule that's up for discussion today. But before I do that, I do always like to begin with a little icebreaker, just to get us all in the mood for some constructive deconstruction. So, Lewis and Leslie, I am going to ask each of you in turn, do you think of yourself as a rule follower or a rule breaker? And I'm going to start with Lewis.
Well, this one actually gave me more pause than all of the other questions you sent over before the podcast. I think as a very young child, I was very much a rule follower, but I think on reflection, a lot of that is to do with like a fawn response, you know, as an anxiety kind of thing. And then that kind of stopped working at a certain point and I stopped being a rule follower. I would say now I'm much more of a kind of values follower. So I'm not a big fan of rules, but I do think that I have values that I try and stick to and follow those instead.
Okay, that makes sense. Leslie, what about you?
Well, I would probably say in practice, I'm quite law-abiding and rule-following. But in my head, I think of myself as a bit more of a rebel, and I like to challenge ideas and rules. And I think it's highlighted at home probably because I have a husband who likes to follow rules. So say we were going for a walk, he would stick to the designated footpath where I'd go off and explore. Or if we're playing a board game, I'd like to make my own rules up or family rules, whereas he would like to stick to the actual rules. It doesn't always work because he's a great cook, but he likes to follow a recipe, whereas I just chuck everything in. And when my children were younger, they used to say, please don't go away, Daddy, on business, because we have to eat Mummy's food.
But sometimes something wonderful comes out of it, surely.
Absolutely, or now and then.
Okay, well, I think that tells us quite a lot already about how this conversation is likely to develop. So, without further ado, let's move on to the main event. The rule we are going to be pulling apart today is this: always stick to the seating plan. Now, I think we know why this is a rule in so many schools. It's not in every school, but it is in a lot of schools. And it makes sense. You've got, 30 children possibly in your class. They've all got different needs, personalities, and friendship dynamics, which, by the way, change on a daily basis. So if they're managed well, a seating plan can help with behaviour, concentration, visibility, support, loads of things, right? But what if seating plans are about something bigger than where children physically sit? What if they are saying something about what we think learning looks like? I suppose that's the question I want to ask you to start with, really. Are seating plans really about learning, or are they mostly about control? Okay, Lewis, what do we think a seating plan is really about?
I think it's everything you've mentioned. Like, there is kind of an element of wanting to do it for genuinely good reasons, of wanting to help people with their, academic progress, with wanting to give them the environment that you think will help them to learn in whatever quotes that wants to put in it best. But I think it would be disingenuous for anybody to not say that a part of it is about crowd control, giving yourself a slightly easier life, about, for everybody in the room, reducing the mental load, which, coming in and going, either time-wise, how long does it take to everybody to find their seat for today? Or how long does it take for somebody who's maybe trying to lead the room to choose the spaces? But I think there's value. I personally would say that there is value in that time and in that decision-making process, that by jumping over it and just saying, no, blanket, this is where we sit, that we are potentially missing out on some very valuable time to develop what might be called soft skills.
Yeah, I see what you're saying. And I can see you nodding there, Leslie. Is that resonating with you too?
Yes, I would agree. I think a lot of it is about control, and there's nothing wrong with having control of your classroom. You absolutely need to do that. I think that it's about who are we doing it for. A seating plan is really effective if the teachers thought carefully about how it'll support the children. So it might be that you do have to reduce some disruption, or it might be that you have some children who are quiet, and by putting them with somebody a little bit more outgoing, it brings them out and draws them into what's going on in the classroom. I personally would think a seating plan needs to be adapted and changed if you're going to use one, lesson to lesson, or even within a lesson, because you don't want just to have children stuck in the same place all the time. And it did bring to mind, when I was thinking about this, about a director of education. I went to his retirement meeting, and he said something that stuck with me. It was years ago, but he said he tried to go around every school in the authority in which he was working. And the thing that struck him most was the most effective schools were run for the children and families, and the least effective schools were run for the benefit of the staff. Now, I'm not saying that you shouldn't do things to keep staff morale up and to keep staff happy, but I think you do have to evaluate. And in early years, we have to think very carefully about routines and boundaries. The seating plan falls into that category. Routines and boundaries, children respond well to them, but there has to be a good reason for them. And I think some routines and boundaries can be helpful, and some can be very restrictive. And I think if we're going to use a tool like a seating plan, you would need to think about, is this helping and supporting learning, or is it being restrictive?
Yeah, and different children are going to necessarily experience it in a different way. I wonder if perhaps teachers can sometimes underestimate the impact of something like a seating plan on different children. I also worry a bit about children getting typecast, almost. You mentioned just now, Leslie, you might have sort of quieter children, and perhaps you want to mix them up with some louder. But if you make that almost explicit in a seating plan, do you risk children then, acting to the roles that they've been given? What do you think, Lewis?
I think there's something tricky in the premise there, or in maybe the needs that the classroom education system has that are different to the work that I do, in that just on the face of it, the idea of going, we've got somebody who is, let's say, less keen to participate verbally, and somebody who's more keen to participate verbally, and a bit higher up, the idea of putting them together seems to be that the goal would be to homogenize the experience, that you are wanting somebody who's very eager to be involved to be pulled in a little bit by somebody who's nervous, and somebody who's not as keen to be pulled up, if you like. And that only exists if you're trying to deliver a homogenous education experience, rather than saying, I can see that this person needs a way to do it which is less high impact, less high energy, and so I'm going to facilitate that person's learning this way. And this person needs high energy, high impact, and so we're going to go and do that in a different space over there. That, I get what you're saying about the typecasting thing, but at a higher level, there's an effort to homogenize it, which isn't something that takes place in my work.
I hear you, yes. And I suppose in a traditional classroom setup, that kind of is what you want, or perhaps that's what we think an orderly classroom does look like. Everyone functioning at more or less the same energy level and more or less the same engagement level. Whereas, of course, human beings aren't really like that, are they? Okay, this is a very good start. I would like to dig down a little further and see what we can find. Okay, so it seems to me that once you start thinking about the sense of seating plans, it really doesn't take long to realise that they raise all sorts of questions about the whole education environment, the space in which we expect all children with all their differences to learn. Leslie, what do you think makes the adults in the room feel safer with very structured classroom layouts? Do you think they are for the adults?
Sometimes they are. Sometimes they're for the wider good, but I think quite often they are for the adults. Teaching in general has gone down a route where things are a little homogenous, more so than I would like, as Lewis has brought up. Teachers perhaps have become nervous or not used to being a little bit more spontaneous in the classroom and responding to children. And as with an early years background, that is how I would operate. So I wouldn't really be using a seating plan. But, I can think back to times teaching older children when I perhaps have used organise where children sit a little bit more. I think, though, that there's something much deeper at the heart of this. It's to do with children's dispositions towards learning. And I think it's to do with the curriculum that they're presented. Those two things perhaps make people perceive the need for a seating plan. And actually, if you concentrate much, early on, but also more in primary than they do, on developing children's independence of learning, on developing their self-regulation skills. If you present a curriculum that's more based on their needs and their interests rather than what the government have said is the curriculum. Not that there is good and bad in all the curriculums out there, but perhaps the emphasis is wrong. And if you've got children, what I see perhaps is children that I've had in the early years, and they've gone into primary school, and the learner that I've seen has disappeared altogether because of the restrictions and the formality of the classroom that they're walking into.
I see. So it's almost like we're looking at this through the wrong lens completely. The seating plan is perhaps fixing a problem that wouldn't exist if we approach the actual business of education differently. Lewis, I'm really interested in your perspective on this, because what you do is very different from a traditional classroom setup. I'm interested in understanding a bit more about how the space that you operate in works for the children. So you've got learning is child-led and curiosity is everything, but also, at the risk of sounding slightly inane, you do need to keep everyone safe. There do need to be rules and regulations. So what does that look like in practice?
I think, I can visually describe it. Our site is about 3 acres of ancient woodland. We're very we're very lucky that it is on a hillside, which means that we actually have some really nice spots where you can stand in one spot and you can observe quite a lot of different pockets of activity without having to be overbearing and kind of getting involved in stuff at a level that's kind of, disrupts what's going on. So, and this is where I should maybe add to what I was saying earlier about, it's the needs of the classroom education. And I don't believe that anyone I've ever known in my past life as a teacher or now who, genuinely is doing anything that they think is harmful. I think that often the things like seating plans come out of a need of I am one adult in this many children. I am one adult in this space. And so I just wanted to preface that that is a legitimate need, and it's not been kind of self-imposed. That's imposed, upon a lot of teachers. In the setting that I'm in, we're I was going to say lucky, but it's not lucky. It's intentional that what we do has a very high adult ratio, so that we can be more attentive, we can move around, we can be more flexible, we can kind of catch pockets of interest and follow them, and not be tied to, I have to be able to see 30 of you in this space. We have groups that are under 15 in terms of how many people we have, and we have between 3 and 4 adults, sometimes even more than that, on the site. So we're very intentional that what we believe makes a good experience needs that level of care and that level of time invested in those conversations of who you're engaging with today? How do you want to engage with what you're interested in? What does that look like? So it's being intentional about it and acknowledging that we're in a privileged position to be able to do that a lot of people aren't, so we're very grateful for that.
Yes, but you've made it happen because it's what you believe is the right thing to happen. It's quite circular like that, isn't it? I'm also interested in this idea of about what good learning is supposed to look like. Because I do think that there is either implicitly or explicitly this idea that people have that good learning is children at their desks in rows, eyes on the teacher, quiet, focused. That's when learning's happening. But also, when I visit schools and walk around, if I walk into a classroom where there's that buzz happening, where the children are talking to each other about their learning, you can feel it. There's a real excitement about that. And that, to me, feels more, I don't know, it feels like something's happening. Leslie, I'm thinking about your experience in the early years. And of course, in the early years, no one would argue that play, movement, talk, all of these things are how the learning is happening. So at what point, given that if they are going to go through the traditional school system, they will end up in a school hall doing formal exams at some point, at what point do we start formalising the way that children learn and expecting them to become, I don't know, more physically controlled?
I think the whole notion of a seating plan almost implies some kind of passiveness and children being the receivers. And I think at all stages, children should be engaged and active in their learning. It might look different at different stages and different ages. Our education system brings children into formal education too soon. I have been out to Scandinavia and places and seen where children are starting more formal school at 6, 7, that kind of age. That is far better for them. Even if we have a legal starting age that's earlier, we could look at what they're being offered. And there's no, I think that play and things should continue on. Our curriculum can seem quite restrictive in terms of children's learning. There's too much emphasis, and I'm not against it, but there's a lot of emphasis on knowledge and particular skills, and those things are very important. I think it is very important that children are numerate and that they're literate, but I would see those as a toolkit.
Right.
And children need to learn those things, and it should become a toolkit. We sometimes put a ceiling on what children can achieve because what we're doing is concentrating on giving them those tools and that toolkit and that block of knowledge. And actually, to me, children make real progress when they take that, they take control of it and do something different with it, that they become creative or they become more experimental or they begin to challenge it. That's where the depth of learning takes place.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm thinking about going back to this idea that you were saying earlier, Lewis, about trying to make everything homogenous and just how that jars so completely with what we know about children and how different they all are as individuals, obviously. And I do wonder whether if we try to create the perfect learning environment for 30 children at once, if we end up getting it wrong for almost everybody, but not so wrong that it's hugely obviously problematic. In your setting, Lewis, do you often come across children who would have been labelled difficult learners or problematic children in a different environment? Do you see different things in the children that you're working with?
Yeah, without a doubt. I see different people than you would if they were in a classroom, and that's kind of true of all human beings. If you put me in an auditorium, I will be a different human being. If you put me in a crowded concert, I will be a different person. So that's not just a kind of like an educational thing or a childhood thing. That is true of all humans everywhere. I think one of the things which is the biggest change between that kind of, you're talking about a perfect system and what would that look like? And it really depends what your metric for perfect is, because if you change what the metric is, if the metric is test results, then you can absolutely optimize a setting for test results. If you're optimizing for ability to recite things, you would create a completely different environment. And those things are each person who has each of those metrics as their top priority would look at it and each one and say, this is perfect. And each person will say, no, this is perfect. So it's more about the metric that you're choosing when you're designing or developing or facilitating a space, rather than being able to say what is and isn't perfect. In the same way that we can't say, if you talk about health, people will say, oh, BMI is how you measure health, or athletic ability is how you measure health. But it's a judgment call that we're trying to find a metric for. And the same thing is true in education. And so the metric that I think I'm trying to optimize for more often than not is the relationship with curiosity, because I wholeheartedly believe that if somebody takes 2 more years to develop handwriting that's legible, but their relationship with handwriting is better at the end, that is more beneficial long term. And if you expand that out to all kinds of learning, I would far rather live in a society where, hey, maybe not everybody knows the 3 types of rocks that can form, but they do have a relationship with learning where if they're interested, they don't feel any trauma about going to look that up in the library or going to find some YouTube videos about it. I'm optimizing for that relationship to learning rather than outputs.
Absolutely. And I can see you nodding furiously there, Leslie. Again, are you singing from the same hymn sheet?
Yes. The whole idea of things being perfect is really quite interesting. You are not going to get a perfect environment for all children, but if you begin to think about the individual children and what they need, you can begin to adapt, and the diet doesn't have to be the same for all children. And I know, again, that's difficult in managing that, and it brings up issues, but it's not impossible. And the other thing about perfect that really interests me is that, and it relates to Lewis's point about curiosity, I think children learn far more from trial and error and by making mistakes and things not being perfect. And I think perhaps that the view of the classroom could be a little bit like that, couldn't it? That you, with the children, evaluate how successful a learning experience was and what went well for them and what didn't, and involve them in the process. And there's nothing more powerful, is there, than a teacher actually saying, actually, that didn't go so well. How could we have approached that differently? What will we do next time when we look at this topic? How can we make it so that it'll be more effective for you as a learner?
Yeah, definitely. We don't include their voices in deciding what these metrics are, do we? Or at least, not often enough. I don't think. Okay, I would like us to move on a little bit and have a think about the idea of inclusion. So we know, and we've said it earlier, and we keep coming back to it, classroom environments are not experienced equally by all children. And for some pupils, a noisy, a crowded, chaotic, or a highly restrictive classroom can feel genuinely overwhelming. But also at the same time, some children might find freedom and flexibility dysregulating rather than liberating. I know that I was talking to a group of pupils the other day in a secondary school. They were all neurodiverse in a mainstream school. And one of the issues that troubled them the most was what happened when teachers and classrooms and seating plans were changed unexpectedly with no notice. So, Leslie, how does that work? How do we make sure that we are accommodating the needs of those who need that level of predictability and order without restricting those for whom it is restrictive?
I think it hinges on a few things. I mean, I've already mentioned routines and boundaries, and sometimes they are very important to children and they rely on them and they need them. But again, it's evaluating them. Are there routines and boundaries that are there for the adults, or are they there to support the children? And are they helping the children? And again, about going back to including the children. One of the things as a head teacher in a nursery school for 11 years, and I was very spontaneous, I would say. So I was going to come up with an idea for a new role play area, and suddenly the furniture would be moved that afternoon and the whole thing would be changed. And then I got a new assistant head teacher who was quite the opposite. So she liked to ponder things for weeks before we did it. But actually, neither approach was best for the children. And the compromise between the two of us was excellent, because suddenly I realised what I was doing was, by changing that, I was pulling the rug out from under the feet of some of those children who needed to go back and repeat those experiences in that play area. Whereas perhaps the person I was working with was holding them back by not adapting it and changing it enough. And between us, we managed to do that in a much better way, I think. And back to my previous point when we were discussing the classroom organisation, we would involve the children in it. If you involve the children in it, it's much better. So if you are neurodiverse and you're going to be alarmed by something in the classroom changing or the resources changing, if you try to involve them in helping to select the resources or to allow them to say which resources they really need to stay there, it's not perfect and it's not always easy, but I think that helps with that.
Yeah. No, absolutely. It is, again, coming back to this, bringing the children into the discussion around how their learning is going to happen, I suppose. Lewis, do you think that taking learning outside of a traditional classroom is particularly beneficial for neurodiverse young people? Is that not a thing? What do you reckon?
I think every neurodivergent individual is an individual. And I think
of course.
Any kind of blanket statement about this environment is best or this environment is best. I was talking to somebody who was involved in redesigning a space recently for neurodivergent individuals, adults, to access for like mental health support, and they were designing all of it. And the person relayed to me that somebody on the design team had just said, well, we're going to paint all of the walls blue because blue is good for autistic people. And it's that level of kind of absolute kind of, I'm going to call it space saving, because again, it's people trying to find kind of like, I can learn a thing, I can grab onto it, and they're trying to do their best by being inclusive with the information they have. However, it's blanket statements like that can really affect how the support that people get. And equally, I know some individuals I've worked with who absolutely love being outdoors because the sound doesn't bounce off the walls in the same way. There's space to go everywhere. The way that we operate with a high level of autonomy suits some people. For other people, I've worked with like a low arousal approach, which is where you're not putting too many demands onto people and you're giving them sort of smaller choices. That said, I've also worked with individuals who, when it's raining, individuals with hearing aids have told me that the sound of being under a tarp is not lovely and relaxing. It sounds like static and they can't hear anything. And so There are things like that you have to have a relationship with people for them to feel comfortable saying, I actually can't be in here and hear what's going on. Because if it's a seating plan, if it's we're all going to be in this space, you're starting with a level of hierarchy that is going to chip away at that relationship where people can tell you what they need or what would make them feel better in a space. And so, again, I think you're only going to find out what people need or what makes them feel the most comfortable if you've built the relationship first, and you're not going to build that relationship with a didactic hierarchy.
No, that makes complete sense. And of course, thinking about it, there's no reason why it has to be either everyone has a seating plan or no one has a seating plan. If you've got one individual in the classroom who is more comfortable with some kind of predictability and stability, then you can work with that individual and say, well, no, yes, of course, this is where you can sit and that seat will always be there for you, and build it up from there. It doesn't necessarily mean that everybody has to be in exactly the same spot in the same lesson. Because in a mainstream setting, we are trying to be all things to all people, or we're trying to create in one environment something that is good enough for most of the learners, which sounds like such an incredibly low bar, doesn't it? When you put it like that, it's awful. But then you find schools trying to meet individuals' needs with this whole raft of interventions on interventions on interventions, breakout rooms, regulation spaces, movement breaks, special cards. Leslie, that is clearly ringing some sort of a bell for you.
Yes. Again, that thing about homogenous education, isn't it? And everyone receiving the same and trying to be at the same level and catching people up. And there's all that language and talk around that. And I'm not saying people deserve to be left behind at all. I don't agree with that. But we took a real hard look at this in our nursery, because even in the early years, you're under pressure to put interventions into place. And there's lots of intervention things out there for children, for social and emotional development and the language development, physical development. And we used to run those. And I used to, in the days where you were constantly looking at data, I would check the data and I would see these children are falling behind a little bit in their language or their social things, and we'd put them into a group. And then I'd come the next term and I'd look, and the same children needed to be in a group. And then because children's needs are often complex and interrelated, you would often find that the child who needed some physical intervention also needed language intervention because they were so closely connected and so closely tied. And then I looked at those children who were being pulled out, and then there would perhaps the same children were getting pulled out, 5 or 6 times a week for a short intervention. And actually, when I looked at those children, they were exactly the children who needed the provision that was there all the time. So we really took a long, hard look at this. And actually, we had started to do some forest school style teaching on our grounds. And we realised that when we evaluated what was going on there, the children's social skills went up. Whereas when we were putting them in the intervention group with the lovely Teddy and the activities but as long as you put the same kind of role models and things into the groups that were working in the forest school, the children were getting as much or even much more out of that. And then if you took the children's language needs, so instead of pulling them out and doing their speech and language, if you actually put the adults in the room who were going to deliver that into that room where the children were actually playing, they were getting far more response. So they would start, sit around a water tray and be doing all the things with the mouth and the language, and maybe it was prepositions, perhaps it was a vocabulary extension, perhaps it was actually using the mouth, but doing it where the children were, doing the physical interventions in the main body of the nursery. You could always make sure the children who needed it had a bit of that, but actually all the children benefited from those lovely and exciting activities that come along with those kind of physical things. So I think the whole idea of children with needs can be re-looked at through a different lens, and the whole thing about inclusion, do we really include them, and or are we pulling them out, or are we doing something different that we think is right but actually might not be right for the children?
Exactly. So often inclusion in practice is not about inclusion at all. It's about chipping the child into the shape that best fits the hole that we want them to sit in, isn't it? Which is the opposite of inclusion, really. I have got a lot to think about from this conversation. Thank you both. But I am conscious that we are running out of time. I think the Student Council will be along soon for their regular planning meeting, and it's probably safer for all of us to be elsewhere when that happens. So let's move on to the final part of our conversation, and that is the verdict. So I am going to ask each of you, Lewis and Leslie, to give your verdict on today's rule, which is, if you can remember all the way back to the start of this conversation, always stick to the seating plan. And I am going to ask you if we should keep it, if we should scrap it, or if we need to give it a serious rethink. And I am going to start with you, Lewis.
I think I would scrap any rule that starts with always. So I don't really need to go much further past the rule than that. So I think it can get in the bin.
Excellent. Love that. Leslie?
Yes, I agree. The word always is the thing that really does jump out to me too, that I would never approach teaching by always doing the same thing. So perhaps from time to time, you might arrange how children are organised, not necessarily seated, but to stick to the same thing all the time, I think is really counterproductive.
Perfect. Well, as I said, I honestly feel like we could have probably carried on rearranging classrooms, dismantling systems and wandering around forests for another 3 hours or so. But I'm sure you have things to do and places to be. So it really is time for us to wrap up now. Lewis, Leslie, thank you both so much. It's been a really thoughtful discussion. It's been really genuinely fascinating. Thank you. And to everyone listening, thank you very much for being here too. I will be back soon with more guests and another school rule to interrogate. And in the meantime, if there's a regulation that has been irritating, baffling, or persistently haunting you since your own school days, do get in touch and tell us about it. The details are in the episode notes. Until then, keep questioning, keep learning, and remember, no running in the corridors.